Hey guys, Nathaniel here with Team Vault. If you enjoy this video, please make sure to check out our others. We do plenty of MTG related content, and like and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be running through a Modern League today. Let's get into it. So this list is one that I saw get featured as one of the 5.0 lists in Modern. And I don't know. I mean, so it's been featured. It's had a lot of 5.0s actually. Some variation of this list. And it's pretty interesting and pretty different to what you'd normally expect to see in Modern, I think. So I figured I would run it through a league because there's lots of cards in here that I quite like. So we're playing a Mardu mid-range deck. Mardu has traditionally not been a color combination that's done particularly well in Modern. Mostly because you're kind of like Jund. So you're playing this mid-range strategy that's aiming to kind of 2-for-1 your opponent and grind them out. You know, like go 1-for-1 in the early game with cards like Lightning Bolts, Thoughtseize and Inquisition, Terminate, stuff like that, and then kill them with some kind of efficient threat, or kind of grind them out with something like Colligan's Command. So the problem for Mardu is they didn't have a threat as good as Tarmogoyf. And I mean, that was really it, actually. You get access to theoretically better sideboard cards from white, but you lose Tarmogoyf. And you just aren't... You can't close games. So, matchups that midrange traditionally struggles with, stuff like Tron and Scapeshift, these kind of like weird inevitability decks, where the longer the game goes on, the more favored they are, and it actually really doesn't matter what cards you're playing, they are more favored the longer the game goes. You know, you can 2-for-1 them all you like, but then they'll just draw like Karn, and it doesn't matter. Or they draw Ugin, and it doesn't matter what you did. So Jund's only way of beating those decks, and Abzan's similar, was like play a turn 2 Tarmogoyf, hit them until they die. And that wasn't even particularly great, but that was the way they did it. And it's similar against combo, so Scapeshift's one of them, but even something like Storm or Ad Nauseam, normally you think of Thoughtseize as being very good against them, and it is, but if you just Thoughtseize them a bunch of times and never put them under any pressure, then eventually they just draw out of it and kill you. So combo matchups are tougher without, again, basically Tarmogoyf in this scenario, because you need something that actually ends the game. So this Mardu list is kind of trying to address the fact that Mardu's big problem is that it's kind of like Jund, but it can never actually close a game, so it's even worse than Jund against a lot of these matchups. So this one's trying to address it. It's playing two Mono 3 Swiftspears, which is a really interesting card to see here, but kind of makes sense. You've got an enormous number of non-creature spells. 4 Young Pyromancers, a card that doesn't normally show up in Modern lists, but is pretty interesting, and obviously very powerful in Legacy, where you have access to far more cantrips. I kind of like Young Pyromancer. I've been trying it out in Death Shadow sideboards recently, to mixed success, but I think this shell definitely looks much better for it. This is kind of like your Tarmogoyf, I think. It's better at grinding than Tarmogoyf is, and slightly worse at closing, but can pretty commonly get to be like, you know, 4 power swinging on turn 4, which is it's kind of less good than Tarmogoyf, but it does make up for it being better in other areas. We're playing Lingering Souls as another threat, another way of ending the game. Lingering Souls is obviously pretty anemic as a threat, but is very strong against other grindy mid-range decks, so it gives us a shore up there. And we're playing 4 Bedlam Revelers. This card's really interesting. I've been enjoying playing this in Legacy, where you can play it alongside Brainstorm, which makes it pretty good, at least in the right deck. But I think this is another way of solving that problem, because, well, the Bedlam Reveler is interesting for 2 reasons. One is that if you can actually consistently cast it for 2, it's really, really great on rate. And this deck doesn't have actually that many ways of getting card advantage. It just has like grind cards. So it has cards that kind of go 2 for 1, but it doesn't mean that you get left with more cards in your hand. It just means your opponent gets left with less. Kolaghan's Command is kind of the exception here. Like Lingering Souls, puts cards takes cards out of your opponent's hand effectively by making them have to deal with it, but doesn't put more into yours. And Pyromancer is similar. So Bedlam Rebel is interesting because it's a good with Lingering Souls, because you can, if you end up discarding Lingering Souls to it because you need to cast this, it's not the end of the world. You still get the flashback. It's good with all of these cheap spells, especially Faithless Looting. A card I don't think you'd normally expect to see here, but pretty much as far as I can tell is here to like power Pyromancer and Bedlam Reveler, and give us a bit of the card selection that blue decks get. This card is nowhere near as good as something like Serum Visions or Ponder or Preordain, or cards we can't play in Modern. But what it does let you do is fill up your graveyard with instants and sorceries for Bedlam Reveler and find the right instants and sorceries to play for the matchup. You'll commonly have, like, let's say you sit down and your opponent is playing Scapeshift, and you have a bunch of Terminates in your hand, or you've drawn a Terminate and a Kolaghan's Command, and neither of these cards are particularly good against Scapeshift. But you have a Faithless Looting, so you're Faithless Looting, and you draw Thoughtseize, Young Pyromancer, and you're like, great, ditch this Terminate and this Kolaghan's Command, and it's sort of like you've just drawn 2 cards. Given that these cards weren't cards in the matchup, that you were never going to get to use them for any real purpose. Obviously, Terminate does kill Primeval Titan, but most of the time, once they've resolved a Primeval Titan, like, killing it is the least of your worries. Yeah, so like a lot of the time, Faithless Looting does let you kind of filter through your deck to reasonable effect. Bedlam Rebel also is this source of card advantage. It's one of the best top decks that you can have in this sort of grindy mid-range matchups from this sort of deck. It's draws 3 cards. It's kind of unkillable. The only thing that really deals with it is Path or Terminate. Dismember can, but I mean, you can also, if you've drawn 2 instant speed spells with it, then you can blank their Dismember, which also makes them feel pretty bad, as they've often paid 4 life to make you play 2 spells. Obviously, that's not always the case, but it can end up happening that way. It's quite a quick clock because it draws 3 cards. It's very likely that it draws you 3 spells to cast that pump it, and then potentially draw into more spells. Again, it's good with Faithless Looting because Faithless Looting also has flashback, similar to Lingering Souls. Well, obviously, there's the non-bow there where you cast them out of the graveyard and then you reduce your Bedlam Revelers the discount. But there's also the thing of you discard them and it's not the end of the world because you still get to flash them back. I'm not sure if Bedlam Reveler totally solves the Goyf problem, but it's certainly an interesting attempt at a solution. And there are, I think, basically non-white decks, I think, are going to really struggle with killing it because, again, it's Terminate, Path, and Dismember are really the only played removal spells in Modern, I think, that kill it. The sideboard... Okay, so no, yeah, before we get to the sideboard, we have 1 Blood Moon in the deck, which... The deck is kind of weird. You'll see that it has a lot of red mana symbols. It is primarily a red deck. And in fact, if we have a Blood Moon down, a lot of our lands are going to come in as mountains, and we only have 1 basic swamp, aside from our mountains and non-basic lands. So we're not really a good deck at minimizing the symmetry of Blood Moon exactly. We sort of are because we can just keep, you can resolve a Faithless Looting through a Blood Moon, which lets you discard your, white cards that you don't need anymore because you can't cast them. And if you know you're going to resolve a Blood Moon, you can often fetch a swamp. We have 5 fetches that get swamps. So you can fetch your basic swamp to allow you to cast pretty much everything in your deck, except Lingering Souls and Lightning Helix. But yeah, we have 1 Blood Moon in the main deck, which probably is there to help out some matchups like Tron or Scapeshift that otherwise are pretty tough, I imagine. And we have 2 more in the sideboard, which I imagine are often coming in as the white cards are going out. most of the matchups where I want a Blood Moon, I can imagine I don't want a Lightning Helix. Then we also have 2 Fatal Push, which is a really odd card to see in a sideboard, but it makes sense to me here. We're trying to be a bit more aggressive, I think. We have a lot of, like, we have 2 Forked Bolts and a Burst Lightning in our main deck, which is not normally what you'd expect to see, but we just want to pile on more damage. We're kind of like a weird Mardu burn list, except we're also running Kolaghan's Command and Lingering Souls. But yeah, so Fatal Push is something we want post-board against Goyf decks, or commonly like Shadow decks, decks that we otherwise have we struggle to answer their stuff efficiently. Obviously, Fatal Push is a great card. It's good to have access to it. It's a good reason to run black. We have 4 Leyline of the Void, which is I kind of like as an approach to graveyard decks. I feel like most of the time, stuff like Nihil Spellbomb ends up feeling a bit anemic against the dedicated graveyard decks, and not worth even bringing in against the non-dedicated graveyard decks. So unless you're interested in playing like stuff like Relic or Rest in Peace, which I don't think we are, because we have Bedlam Reveler, Lingering Souls, Faceless Looting, and Kolaghan's Command, all of which don't really want us to play Rest in Peace or Relic of Progenitus. So this is, I think, the best one-sided answer to graveyards. And is well, it takes up a lot of sideboard space. I think a pretty solid strategy and a good plan against those matchups. To just say, all right, against Dredge, I'm just slamming 4 Leyline of the Void in my deck, and then I'm just gonna mulligan to Leyline, and like that's gonna be good enough. And it's more commonly good enough against recent Dredge, a good post-Grave Troll Dredge. We also have 1 Shattering Spree. For Affinity, Eldrazi Tron, anything that uses artifacts. I imagine that we're not that interested in blowing up artifacts. We have lots of removal for Affinity, so I don't imagine that's a particularly tough matchup. And we do already have 3 Kolaghan's Commands in our main deck, so Shattering Spree just helps out. It's also very good against Chalice. It's just a good, efficient way of answering that card. We have 2 Wear Tears, which, while it does also say Destroy Target Artifact, I imagine it's primarily there for problematic enchantments, possibly stuff out of blue-white control, where they're playing stuff like Spreading Seas, which I imagine can mess us up a little bit. But also they can play weird stuff like Ruined Halo and Detention Sphere, that we're pretty interested in not having happen, because Ruined Halo naming like Pyromancer's not too bad, but Ruined Halo naming Bedlam Reveler can shut off a large number of our threats. I imagine, this maybe Leyline. Yeah, maybe we want this against something like Ad Nauseam or other combo decks that bring in Leyline. That seems interesting. I'm not sure. Enchantments in Modern are always something I don't think about, and then kind of realize there are more than I expect. But it's good to have something like this in the sideboard. Man, that art on Tear is kind of weird. Oh well. We have 2 Pithing Needles, which is quite a versatile card. It's never... I always feel like Pithing Needle is half as good as any specific card ends up being. But it is still quite good to have in your sideboard, and it's quite versatile, and it gives this deck a reasonable answer to stuff like Planeswalkers or weird things from combo decks, weird activated abilities. Stuff like Lightning Storm from Ad Nauseam can be a bit odd. It's good against Affinity as well. Naming Cranial Plating is much easier than having to kill every single Cranial Plating they play. So overall, I think it's like a worthwhile card to have in the sideboard. And then Dragon's Claw is pretty much, from what I can tell, just there for the burn matchup. But I could see bringing it in other aggressive matchups where life matters. Because we have so many red spells, it's quite common we're going to be triggering this ourselves. So I can see it mattering in matchups where life total matters. But that is still mostly red matchups, like Burn, maybe Zoo, although I'm not seeing anyone running like Zoo recently. And I feel like something like Grixis Death Shadow, or not Grixis Death Shadow, but like Death Shadow Zoo, or like the Vengevine Hollow One decks, your life total sort of matters, but not in like a 1 life point per spell cast kind of way, like it does against Burn. Against them, I feel like you need basically Leyline. So that's what we're looking at. That's the list we're going to be running, featuring such modern staples as Burst Lightning and Forked Bolt. Well, those are actually the weirdest cards in the list. Everything else I think is pretty interesting to see. I guess Bedlam Reveler. This card's pretty weird. No one is running Bedlam Reveler. Okay. That's the deck. Let's get stuck in. Let's see if we can win a match with Mardu something.